Hello, my name is Bryce Wakefield and I'm the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Territorial disputes of East Asia are particularly contentious and are loaded with questions of geostrategic import, economic weight, and national identity. Arguments over what appear to be insignificant rocks off the coast of Japan have the potential to spark major conflict in the region. It's therefore important that we understand these dynamics, or the dynamics behind these disputes, and joining me to discuss those dynamics is Dr. Alexander Bukh. Hello, Alex.
Hi, Bryce. How are you doing?
Good. Alex is a senior lecturer at the Victoria University of Wellington. He is the author of a book on how Russia has been represented in Japan's cultural and foreign policy discourse, and he's been published in several leading academic journals, including European Journal of International Relations, Asian Survey, International Relations of the Asia Pacific, and Pacific Review. He's the author of the book that is the subject of this talk, These Islands Are Ours, The Social Construction of Territorial Disputes in Northeast Asia. He holds an LLM from Tokyo University and a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics. So we shall now pass things over to Alex to hear what is sure to be a fascinating talk on the territorial disputes of Northeast Asia. And we'll come back here for the Q&A. Thanks, Alex.
Let me just start with my presentation. I'll share the PowerPoint presentation I have. Right, so this is the cover of my book, which came out in March, just before the COVID pandemic spread to this part of the world. Right, so these are the disputes that I'm talking about in this book. And as you can see, I mean, all of these disputes involve islands, all of these disputes involve Japan, basically, and its neighbors. So we have the Northern Territories dispute with Russia. And in the north, we have the dispute over Dr. Takeshima in the Sea of Japan with Korea. And we have the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands dispute with China and Taiwan in the south. So these are disputes. I hope you can see them. You can also Google this map. So these are disputes we're talking about. I'm looking in my book, and I was thinking about how to structure this talk. We have an hour. I just recorded a podcast which basically discusses my book, and it's a very interesting series. Please allow me to advertise it. It's basically new books in East Asian studies. I think quick search on Google, you'll reach it eventually. The whole process took about an hour and 20 minutes. So I decided it's probably best not to discuss the whole book and all the chapters, because each chapter is basically a case study. What I decided to do is to introduce the argument I'm trying to make, my framework, the argument I'm trying to make in this book overall, and then to look into one dispute of a Dr. Takeshima. And this is basically what you can see behind what you can see in my screen. This is behind me. This is Dr. Takeshima. This is the dispute between Japan and Korea. And I'm more than happy to refer to other disputes in the Q&A and to answer any questions. Questions that I can answer. So what is the argument? What is my framework of analysis, and what is the argument I'm trying to make in this book? First of all, I make a distinction between disputes themselves and their social construction. So those of you familiar with the international relations theories and the different schools of thought in international relations, they would know what social construction, what it means. But if you don't, basically I'm talking about perceptions of these disputes, the way they're seen in the society, the way they're perceived by the society, the way they're perceived as important, related to a certain sense of victimhood, injustice. So disputes themselves, basically, if we look at quite a few really good books on the disputes that look at the history, the politics, negotiations, legal arguments. The disputes themselves basically can be traced to the San Francisco Peace Treaty, the politics of Cold War. Basically, if we look at the San Francisco Peace Treaty, you can see that the references to Japan's borders are very brief and very vague, and this leaves basically room for different interpretations. And that's what happened in the case of Japan and all of its neighbors. But I'm interested in the constructions, in the perception of this series of these disputes. So, for example, I was just reading now still reading a book on Japan-Korea relations, published in 1985 by one of leading Korean scholars. And there's no mentioning at all of the territorial dispute between Japan and Korea. The book looks at different aspects, very good, very well-researched book. And so the reason for the dispute is missing from there is not because, I mean, it's not negligence on behalf of the author, but it is simply because then this dispute was not seen as significant, as important in bilateral relations. So the question that I'm trying to ask in this book is basically how these perceptions, these ideas about these territories, how do they emerge? And the answer that I'm giving here is that these social constructs, these ideas attached to these territories, first of all, they emerge from critical junctures. And let me show you a definition of critical juncture. It's basically a period of significant social change that threatens or destroys. So basically, it's a period of significant social, political, or economic change in a particular society. So they emerge from these critical junctures, which actually usually are unrelated to the disputing questions. So these are the structural kind of factors that lead to the emergence of this constructs. And then these ideas, these perceptions, they form in the process of interactions between the state in question and national identity entrepreneurs. And this is also a term, critical junctures is not my term. National identity entrepreneurs is a term I introduced here. Basically, I'm referring to non-state actors. So this can be anybody. This can be an individual, civil society group, or any other entity, basically that is not the state, which creates and actively promotes a certain narrative that involves the nation, that appeals to the nation, that relates certain issue to the nation as a whole. Yes, so basically this is the argument I'm trying to make, that these constructs emerge in the process of interactions. Quite often this is basically a result of contentious activism by these non-state actors, which is aimed at addressing a certain threat or a failure by the state. And the argument I'm making, the territory by itself is basically, it's meaningless. It doesn't have any meaning, national territory. It's simply a rhetorical resource or a tool used by these activists to position themselves as champions of the nation, to mobilize support and occasionally to avoid sanctions. The causes of this activism and the goals of the activists, they lie somewhere elsewhere. They are unrelated to the territorial disputes. But in the process of when they invoke the nation and they interact with the state, this is when this ideas, the social constructs emerge. So this is the general argument I'm making. And what I would like to do now is just to discuss the Dr. Takeshima. So I'll skip all this. I've got here slides on all of the disputes, but I will focus on Dr. Takeshima. I'll look on both sides, on Japan and Korea, and just to show you what exactly, what kind of arguments I'm making here. So this is, I apologize, the only map I managed to find is in Japanese, which shows basically the distance to both Japan and Korea. Basically, I mean, as you can see from my screen, we're talking about two rocks, middle of nowhere, I think safe to say, the Sea of Japan, or the East Sea as it's called in Korea, about 217 kilometers to Korean mainland, and about the same distance to Japan mainland. This is Shimane Prefecture, which administered those rocks from 1905 till 1945, till Japan's defeat. This is Uling Island, which, well, administers, well, it's part of the North Gyeongsang province, but these rocks, Dokdo as they're known in Korea, belong basically to this administrative unit. So let's look how this perception, the social construct that these rocks are very important for the nation on both sides of the Sea of Japan. Let me start with Japan. So basically, the Shimane Prefecture, which administered those Takeshima, and I will refer to Takeshima as Takeshima when I discuss the Japanese side, and I will refer to the rocks as Dokdo when I discuss the Korean side, because they have different names, and the naming is part of the conflict itself, of the dispute. Sorry. So if we look at Takeshima, Shimane Prefecture starts to lobby the government from 1951, demanding the government to do something about, to establish this, its territorial control over these rocks. And why? What is the critical juncture here? Basically, it's Japan's defeat, kind of obvious, I think. Japan is defeated. Japan is occupied by the United States. There's certain reforms that passed in Japan that enable this kind of petitioning, and also local autonomy law in 1947 is passed, which gives a certain autonomy to the prefectures, because until then they were under pretty strict control by the government. It is also important to remember the economic conditions that followed Japan's defeat. So first of all, we've got the so-called MacArthur line. So this was basically a certain line, maritime line, imposed by the occupation authorities in Japan, beyond which Japanese fishermen, Japanese fishing vessels could not go, and Takeshima was placed outside of this line. At the same time, we also have the return of Japanese settlers from Korea. So if you look at the map, basically Shimane Prefecture is facing Korea, and many of the Japanese settlers that settled in Korea during the formerly 40 years of Japan's colonial rule over Korea, they return to Japan and they settle in Shimane Prefecture. So the economic conditions are obviously impacted by this increase in population. And another reason is that until then, it's quite a complicated story, but I'll make it simple and short. Basically, the maritime resources around these two rocks are monopolized until 1945 by a very small number of families from Shimane Prefecture and those that settled in colonial Korea, Japanese, of course. But this monopoly is abolished. So basically, according to Japanese law, now fishermen from Shimane Prefecture can go there and engage in fishing activities, but they cannot, because the rocks now they were from 1951. Korea establishes de facto control over the rocks and has been administering them since then. But at that point, Shimane Prefecture's position is the same as Tokyo, it's the central government. So the central government is also demanding Korea to return these rocks to Japan's control. But this changes in 1965 when Japan and Korea they normalize their relations. They sign the basic treaty between Japan and Korea, and they decide to shelve the dispute, the territorial dispute, because both sides realize that the dispute is not really, I mean, this rock's not really important. They cannot compromise for domestic political reasons. Neither side can give up the control of the rocks, but they decide, I mean, it's not important. Let's just shelve it for for a while. So what happens from 1965, basically Tokyo central government, Japan's government is not paying any attention to these rocks. They disappear almost entirely from the political discourse. But at the same time, from late 1960s, the central government is engaging in a lot. It basically creates this domestic campaign related to the northern territories, to the territories disputed with Russia, Soviet Union then, sorry. And this is done again for domestic political reasons, but basically quite a lot of money is going into this domestic campaign. And Shimane Prefecture is not seeing any of this. I mean, it's not seeing any budgetary allocations related to the dispute with Takeshima. So this sense of deprivation, sense of injustice compared to northern territories, compared to Hokkaido, a prefecture that emerges in Shimane Prefecture. And I wouldn't argue that the two Takeshima becomes very important part of prefectural agenda, but it's always there. It's always in the background, kind of a symbol of injustice vis-a-vis Tokyo, vis-a-vis the center. So it becomes a certain issue of this like inequality in prefecture and center relations. But so they oh, sorry, I just skipped. Sorry. Yes. Return to the right slide. So there are all kinds of ups and downs during the Cold War in 1990s. There's certain tensions because the two sides need to renegotiate the Fisheries Treaty. But overall, things are more or less quiet. With few ups and downs. But in 2005, Shimane Prefecture passes the Takeshima Day Ordinance, basically commemorating the 22nd of February as the Takeshima Day, which doesn't have, I mean, purely symbolic, doesn't have any national significance. The ordinance, and it's quite important, it's passed against Tokyo's position, because there's quite a considerable pressure applied from Tokyo not to adopt this Takeshima Day Ordinance, because Japan and Korea relations are already tense. They all kind of issues related to historical memory. So Tokyo applies pressure. Despite this pressure, Shimane Prefecture passes the Takeshima Day Ordinance in 2005. So why is that? What happens in 2005? Like, why did it decide to? Obviously, I mean, there are quite a few factors here related to tensions in bilateral relations. But the argument I'm making here, that the most important critical juncture here is Prime Minister Koizumi reforms, which have nothing to do with Takeshima or territorial dispute or Japan-Korea relations. What are Koizumi reforms? Prime Minister Koizumi, Junichiro Koizumi, quite a popular leader, he becomes prime minister against all odds from a small fraction inside the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. But basically passes those fiscal reforms called Trinity reforms, an important part of which is to create more autonomy for Japan's prefectures, or Japan's Japan's regional governments. But as a result, the budgetary allocations to the regions, to the prefectures, decreased significantly. And Shimane Prefecture has been the poorest prefecture all the way through Japan's post-war history. So its dependence on these allocations is quite high. And by looking at into domestic debates inside among the lawmakers in the prefectural assembly, basically I'm arguing the argument I'm making here, and again, this is interpretation. Nobody says we are adopting this Takeshima Day because of Koizumi reforms. But I think there is enough evidence, and I'm happy to discuss this evidence later on, to show that this was very much a symbolic gesture aimed to show dissatisfaction on behalf of the prefecture with the center, with Tokyo, with Koizumi and his reforms. And also, it's important to remember that the lawmakers in the prefectural assembly, the majority of them, and those that initiate this ordinance are LDP. And LDP is in power in Tokyo. So basically, we have this kind of internal revolt, LDP, local, prefectural level versus the national level LDP. The argument I'm making, another argument I'm making here is that this was made possible because of these Koizumi reforms, which created a lot of frictions inside the LDP. A lot of people left the LDP, lawmakers left the LDP at that time. This Koizumi's intra-LDP reforms, intra-party reforms, they damaged its crisis management mechanisms. So something like this would have been unimaginable in other times, that local level lawmakers pass a certain ordinance which goes against the policy of the center. And so I think we can trace it basically, as an opportunity, as you can see on the slide, basically, that the crisis management mechanism of the party was weakened. So these are the causes behind the Takeshima Day. And after that, there was a strong Korean reaction, domestic media coverage. So the government was forced to respond to this in one way or another. And gradually, the government, what we see is that the central government is kind of co-opting this argument made and the ideas about Takeshima that emerged from Shimane Prefecture. This intensifies during Prime Minister Abe's premiership. So Takeshima starts to appear in textbooks, Takeshima's school textbooks. Takeshima becomes quite important in Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs documents, etc. And basically, in this process of interaction of government responding, we can put it this way, I guess, to Takeshima Day Ordinance, this idea, the social construct about Takeshima as being important for Japan, as being part of the national territory, as a symbol of Japanese victimhood, this idea emerges. Now, let me move to the Korean side. So on the Korean side, quite a few activist groups formed in the late 1990s. And many of the leaders of these groups or participants, so I'm talking about civic, basically, so civil society groups, formed to protect doctor, in which this has become all these groups together. They're known today as the Protect the Doctor movement. Many of these activists, they're former student activists, they're active participants in the democratization movement. And the arguments I'm trying to make in this chapter about doctor, that it has to do a lot, the emergence of this protection of doctor movement, and this whole ideas about doctor as being so important for the nation, the symbol of the nation, of the Korean nation. It has to do a lot with the democratization movement, its ideas, and what happened to it and to its ideas in 1990s. So I gave you just one example here of one of the key organizations in the movement, Dr. Headquarters, which was established in 2000 by one of former student activists. All of these organizations, they emerge in Seoul. So they have nothing to do, basically, they don't have any vested interests in Doctor. They're very far from there. They don't have any property. They're not fishermen. We're talking about organizations, purely ideational organizations. So the immediate trigger for this, for the emergence of this movement is the Fisheries Treaty related tensions. Japan and Korea negotiate from mid-1990s till 1998 when they sign a new version of the Fisheries Treaty. Quite a few issues there. Happy to touch on them later. But the argument I'm trying to make here that to understand the broader structural causes of this movement and the argument, the ideas that this movement, these groups have been making, we need to look at the critical juncture. So 1990s, basically, democratization of Korea, and 1997, the financial crisis, the so-called IMF crisis, as it is known in Korea. Which, as I argue here, has threatened Korean national identity as advocated by the democratization movement. So what do I mean? We need to go back a little bit here to give context to this. Opposition has always existed. I mean, throughout Korea's independence years, starting from 1945, there were all kind of democratic opposition, different opposition movements. But basically, the democratic movement that culminated in the in its victory, in the victory of the democratic reforms from 1987 onwards, started in late 1970s. And this movement was led by intellectuals, students, which not only opposed the dictatorial regime in Korea, but they proposed their own version, their own view of Korean national identity. What is Korean national identity? It was very strongly focused on ethnicity, Korean ethnicity. But one of the key features of this identity vision was this concept of Minjung, basically the people, the Korean people, as juxtaposed. So this is not a purely class. This is not the workers and the peasants versus the bourgeois. But we're talking about people quite broadly, who are basically juxtaposed with the elites. Who are the elites? The elites are the rulers. The elites are also those that conspire with outside forces. Outside forces, in this case, it's the United States. It's Japan, which by that time has become 1980s, a very important investor in Korea. So they are inspired by Marxism. They are inspired by Marxism, but this is not pure Marxism. They don't talk about class, but they talk about this people versus the elites. And basically, they see democratization and unification of the peninsula, of the Korean peninsula, as basically coming together as two pillars of the same vision of Korean identity. So this movement, they win. From 1987, Korea embarks on various democratic reforms, new constitution, but this victory did not bring this vision of Korean identity, Korean national identity, to fruition. What happens? First of all, in the 1990s, communism collapses, the Cold War ends, but the collapse of communism basically brought brought the end to various, or let's put it this way, maybe not ended all the leftist movements around the world, but definitely diminished the appeal of various left-leaning movements around the world. And the same happens in Korea as well. Korea is democratized gradually, and Korea does engage from Kim Dae-jung onwards, 1997 onwards. Korea engages in dialogue, the so-called Sunshine Policy dialogue with North Korea. So relations improve, but unification is probably as far as it was before. And Korea continues to maintain close relations with the United States, which was seen as the outside force, and Japan, outside force, part of the oppressing regime by the democratization activists. But the 1997 crisis, basically, I think it dealt the last blow to this vision of Minjung, of Korean national identity, because it just showed to Koreans how embedded the country, the economy is in international capitalist economy. So 1990s, towards the end of 1990s, basically this vision of Minjung, alternative vision of Korea, of Korean identity collapses. And the argument that I'm making is that this preoccupation with doctor, or the emergence of doctor as a national symbol, as the symbol of the nation, is very much a response to this threat to national identity, national subjectivity, as the democratic activists saw it. So if I'm looking in detail at the arguments that they make, this activists, and how they view doctor, how they view the whole problem, what kind of historical arguments they're making, and the argument I'm making here, that the discourse or the narrative is very similar to the democratization, this Minjung narrative I just discussed, but there's a number of very important changes or transformations that happen here. So first of all, this people elites. Yeah, so people elites dichotomy. So basically the people are being cheated again by the elites, duped by the elites. The elites conspire with Japan to give up sovereignty of a doctor. So this dichotomy is maintained. But any elements of Marxism, any elements of this economic exploitation that's featured in the Minjung discourse, they disappear completely. So this democratization and oppression by the elites now is replaced in this new discourse with territorial consciousness, this idea that Korean people need to achieve proper territorial consciousness. And they need to get rid, this time it's not oppression of the elite, but it's the flunkies of the elites that are the keys to national liberation. And there are quite a few other similarities, which I won't go into detail here, but basically doctor is becoming now the center of the nation, the center of the of national subjectivity, very much transforming this discourse, repeating, but also transforming this discourse on national subjectivity exposed by the democratization activists, and maintaining it, basically maintaining it, stabilizing it. So this is the argument I'm making here. Let me jump. In the conclusions, basically, I'd just like to repeat, basically, this is the argument, one of the arguments I make in this book is the territory by itself is empty signifier. So it doesn't have any inherent, any stable meaning to it. It's filled with content, with meaning, with different associations, different symbolic meanings, depending on the context, depending on the needs of the activists. And the needs of the activists, basically their responses to these various opportunities and threats that emerge from critical juncture. Okay, Northern Territories, Dr. Jayu. Okay, I guess I will stop here. Thank you very much. And I guess we can move to Q&A now. Is it
Thanks,
okay with you,
Alex.
Bryce?
Yes, we are going to move to Q&A now. Just before we get started, I'd like to lay down the ground rules.
Can I
Anybody
stop
can...
sharing? Sorry, Bryce.
What's that? Sorry?
Can I stop the sharing of the
Oh, yes,
slides?
please. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so the ground rules are thus. Everybody can ask questions through the textual Q&A. If you wave your mouse across the screen, you'll see two buttons. One is Q&A and one is raise your hand. Anyone can ask questions through the Q&A. If you see a question you like, then please click the little thumb icon that's below it, and that will make sure that the most popular questions rise to the top. And if you are an AIIA member, and AIIA members only, please, we will be checking, you can press the raise your hand button and we'll see if we can bring you on screen to ask a question. Let me just start with a question that I have. I guess if I hesitate to say Korean nationalist, but if I'm somebody who feels very, very strongly in Korea about Dokdo, as it were, I'd reject your argument, and I would say that the kind of strength of feeling that comes from Dokdo emanates from war memory that has always been there, and that the 1990s, as you correctly point out, were a time of democratization and freedom of speech. And it was simply that the narrative of Dokdo as central to the national identity was shut off during that time by, again, as you rightly pointed out, people who were more fond in making good relations with the Japanese and also the United States. And it's simply that from 1990 onwards, we have a popular expression of national feeling on these islands. I'm not saying that that is what I personally believe, but if I were a Korean nationalist or a Korean who felt very strongly about this is probably what I would argue. What sort of answer would you have to that kind of statement?
Thank you, Bryce. Yes, this is a very good question. I mean, definitely, I mean, this historical memory of Japanese colonization is one of the factors. I mean, definitely it is. It's been looming there in the background, but at the same time, if we look at my next project is to look at Japan-Korea relations more broadly from 1945 onwards. The stuff that, I mean, I looked at some public opinion polls, and if you look at early 1990s, I mean, like Korean, and even I managed to find some references for public opinion polls from 1965. So there were quite a lot of demonstrations against the normalization of relations between Japan and Korea under Park Geun-hye in Korea. But then they had public opinion polls, and they show that actually the anger of the people is directed at the government. And the people perceived, like the majority, or I don't remember the numbers from 1965, 1966, the public opinion polls, but quite a lot of people actually had favorable view of Japan. If you look at the polls from 1990s, early 1990s. Again, I mean, Japan is not the kind of, the most beloved nation by Koreans, to put it mildly. But I mean, the percentage, I mean, you had like maybe 40 to maybe 35 to, 45% of people I mean, they're still in minority, but we're talking about 35 to 40% of people who have favorable views of Japan, right? So I think that historical memories definitely has always been there. To a certain extent. I mean, a lot of Koreans had suffered quite a lot under the Japanese rule. But at the same time, I think like this preoccupation with Dokdo, but also a lot of other issues in Japan-Korea relations today, all this, they're very much products of, so they're always multiple factors. But I think to a great extent, these are products of much more recent events than, kind of memory of what happened then.
Good. Okay, well, let's go to our Q&A now. My gosh, we have a learned audience. I'm going to field a question from Professor Yoichiro Sato, who was here.
Yep.
and is actually presenting on Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy in coming weeks. So please do sign up for that one. He asks, it seems the Takeshima case well support your argument because material interests over the islands are minimal. Whereas if you look at the other cases, the Senkaku Islands and what the Japanese call the Four Northern Territories, there's a much greater, there's much more material, there's much more natural resources, etc. Much more territory, in fact, at stake in the case of the Four Northern Territories. So do you think that that you're kind of picking an easy case here, or how would your argument change in light of these much more substantial material interests?
Thank you, Bryce, and thank you, Sato Sensei. Actually, we met, I think it was it last year in Brisbane. I hope you're doing well. It's a good question. I mean, definitely Northern Territories and Senkaku Islands, the scope of the territory is bigger. The different interests, the strategic interests in the case of Senkaku, I guess. They also, in the case of Northern Territories, maybe some strategic interests on behalf of Russia. Obviously, resources, 18,000 people live on Northern Territories. You're absolutely right. Well, let me start with Senkaku. So the movement, so this whole idea, basically, this Bao Diao, to protect the Diao Yutai, started by Taiwanese students. So obviously, the dispute today is mostly between Japan and PRC. But this protection of Diao Yutai movement started in the United States by Taiwanese students who obviously never been there. And had very vague idea of where the Senkaku Islands are, Diaoyu, I guess, in the case of Taiwanese, where they are, and obviously they understood there's certain economic importance after that 1969 study that found gas and oil there. But I think their interests, and what I argue is that the material interests played a very minor role there. So as we see the evolution, obviously, of the social construct, I guess, I guess like certain interests come to play possibly. But if we look at the origins of these ideas, quite often it's not. In the case of Northern Territories, the movement for the return of Northern Territories was started by people whose livelihoods, so yes, very much resource, economic interests, but then it became very much a political issue, has been used by different actors on Hokkaido. And then in late 1960s, from late 1960s onwards, it has been used by the Japanese, by the central government. So, there's no kind of objective measure, I guess, to say what is an important territory economically. I guess any territory can be regarded as important, and what is not important. When I talk to activists in Shimane Prefecture, they tell me like these rocks. They're very important. There are lots of fish and squid there, which actually is not really true. But anyway. But yes, so there's no objective way, first of all, to measure this. But my argument is these ideas, they transform this constructs. The perceptions, they transform in the process of interaction with various actors.
Good. All right, we have another question here from Reese, who hasn't given his or her last name. Are sovereign states covertly using civil activist groups to shape their own domestic and international policies in order to push forward territorial claims without formally committing their government? So, in a sense, you've presented a picture here of the tail wagging the dog, I guess. Is there a sense that perhaps the dog is indeed in control of its tail?
Yes, thank you, Reese. It's a very good question as well. I guess it's true in some cases. So, for example, in my case studies, it's definitely true for For the Northern Territories, from 1960s or 1970s, I guess, onwards, where basically the Japanese government kind of appropriated this discourse and started using the residents, former residents groups to kind of to show that there's a national solidarity. It's also to a certain extent true for Doctor in the case of Korea, the one that I discussed just now, from 2005-6 onward, when the government also kind of has been trying to co-opt the movement through various means quite successfully, and possibly, I mean, at least not in the cases that I discuss, but possibly it is true for other cases. So this definitely does happen. I'm not saying that this never happens, that the dog wags the tail. But what I'm trying to show here that quite often, and this is, I think, the kind of the common perception that these groups, they've been sponsored by the state, they have some kind of affiliation with the state, there must be like something there connecting them to the state. What I'm trying to show here actually is that no, that sometimes the dog wags the tail, the tail wags the dog. The tail wags the dog, and then the dog has to respond. And this is how this all kind of develops.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, we have a question about Australia. I don't know how much about Australian foreign policy and Australian interpretations of this.
Unfortunately not.
Yeah, okay, but I mean, the question is, what are your thoughts on how DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, has handled the situation thus far? I guess we could perhaps expand that. Are there any examples of foreign actors who may add their weights to this dispute, of what are New Zealand's thoughts on this maybe, or those of the United States? I mean, and do those thoughts matter from external actors? Obviously, the thoughts of the US are given great weight, but what about Australia and New Zealand? Is this a dispute where their views are even considered important by the actors concerned?
Yes, it's a good question. I must admit that I haven't followed the Australian. I would be quite surprised if there's any specific policy. I mean, the United States position, and I think United States, in many ways, because it has been the main architect of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which gave rise to these disputes, has quite a lot of responsibility, and the reversion of Okinawa in 1971. But the United States position has been, we do not support either side. They should reserve them bilaterally. We do not take any stance on territorial claims. Just resolve them in peaceful means. That's all we care about. I would suspect that most other countries would be taking a similar stance. I don't think that even Russia has expressed any, because as you know, Russia's got pretty good relations with China these days. I don't think even Russia expressed any support, let's say, for Chinese claims to Senkaku Diaoyu. Yeah. Sorry, that's all I can say.
Okay, very good. Right, we have a question from Shannon Fraley. We know that the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands are disputed by Japan, China, and Taiwan. The CCP has stated it shall not secede 1 inch of territory. What do you believe this will mean for Japan? Well, at the moment, it's Japan that has administrative control over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. But what's your take on this question, Alex?
Yes, well, as you probably know, I think it's a very good question. As you know, Shannon, Japanese are quite worried about the Senkaku. So, I mean, the whole kind of Japanese defense strategy over the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, I guess, has been very much, refocusing south. Various exercises conducted, in case of this kind of quasi-invasion. For example, mass landings on the Senkaku Islands by Chinese fishermen, or so-called fishermen, or people who look like fishermen, but they're not fishermen actually, so how to respond to this? So I think this has been an issue for Japan, definitely concern for the Japanese. My understanding, and again, I haven't followed like recent developments, my head's been full with COVID-19 over the last couple of months, like most of us, I guess. but I don't think anything particular has been happening there. The last piece of news that I read actually a couple of days ago is that the Chinese, I mean, relations between Japan and China started to warm up before COVID, before the pandemic, because the Chinese, obviously China's relations with the US were worsening. And I think especially now in light of what's happening between China and the United States, the Chinese, I think that they're trying to improve the relations with Japan. I would be very surprised if, you know, there will be something happening there tomorrow. But again, anything is possible, you know, like never say, you know, I try not to predict anything in international politics. Thank you.
Yes, again, my university lecturer, that was the first thing he told me when I took basic politics, is never predict anything.
Never predict anything, yeah.
Yeah, you're always going to be wrong. Okay, so we have another question here from Professor Sato. Hello, Yoichiro.
Yes.
I think it's a question, or rather a comment about a point you made. You said that the two sides shelved the issue.
Yep.
He says it's not clear about the Korean side.
Yep.
Japan has refrained from physically and international legally challenging the status of the ROK administrative control. If the ROK also shelved the dispute, what did the ROK agree to refrain from? There's a related question I'll ask after this, actually.
Thank you, Sato-sensei again. So my understanding is it's a bit tricky because negotiations. So when the in 1964, 1965, there were the negotiations between Japan and Korea were conducted on kind of two levels. There were official negotiations by ministries of foreign affairs, and at the same time there were unofficial negotiations conducted by politicians, so Kishi and friends on the Japanese side, and Kim Jong-pil on the Korean side, and quite a few others. I'm sorry, I don't remember the names now, but there are no records. I mean, there are the records of the official negotiations. There are no records, no official records of the unofficial negotiations, which actually were much more important because that's where all of the difficult issues were sorted. So there's a book which you're probably familiar with by Rod Daniel, who conducted interviews with basically negotiators on both sides, the politicians, and they confirmed to him there was an unofficial agreement to shelve the dispute on both sides, basically to agree to disagree. So the Japanese will not challenge Korean de facto control. The Koreans will not and the Koreans will continue to control the islands, but each side will try to refrain from, referring to this dispute and their domestic politics in international affairs. So this this was confirmed also by Nakasone. Nakasone was also there in recent. He passed away recently, but in one of those numerous memoirs he's written, he confirmed that such an agreement existed. So I think, we can conclude that it did exist, this agreement. What did the Koreans gain? What the Koreans gained from it? Or what the Japanese agreed to refrain from?
What did the Koreans agree to refrain from doing? Yeah.
Yes. So the Koreans agreed basically to refrain from trying to escalate it and refrain from mentioning it in their, or appealing to it in their domestic politics. This is my understanding of what the Koreans agreed to refrain from. And if you look at least at the Park Chun-hee, this was never an issue in bilateral relations. This dispute, since 1965 till 79, I think it was assassinated. Yeah, it was never an issue. And also, in Korean media, domestic politics, it was basically very much ignored.
Good. Okay, so I'll leave my question for now, but there's a question here from Jim Midju, which asks which of these disputes, so I guess between Senkaku, Daoyutai, and the four northern territories, would be the one that Japan would be more likely to pursue over the next 5 to 10 years? Which one would it prioritize, and why?
It's a good question. Japan's official position is, well, obviously Senkaku is, Japan kind of changed recently a bit its stance, but overall Japan stands that there is no dispute because the Senkaku Islands are part of Okinawa Prefecture, so there's no dispute. It kind of admitted half-heartedly that there is some kind of an issue between them and China. But in other two cases, Japan is the claimant. Japan is the one that wants territory to be returned in the case of Takeshima and the Northern Territories. Northern Territories were the pet project of Prime Minister Abe until recently. If you follow Japan-Russia relations, you would know that Prime Minister Abe was the foreign leader that met Putin like the most number of times. They met, I don't know, like what, 20 something, 30 maybe times. I don't remember how many. He was really actively trying to pursue this resolution of this dispute, changing very much Japan's stance and apparently compromising on two islands, but Russia at the end said no. So it's still not clear what's going to happen there. So Prime Minister Abe has pursued it. I think if we look at like what has been his most active policy, obviously defense of the Senkakus, but at the same time, in terms of resolution, I think it was the Northern Territories, but well, fortunately, unfortunately, he failed so far. So yeah, don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. He will probably continue. I mean, well, he doesn't have much. What is it? 2 years to go, I think. A year and a half to go. Anyway.
Okay, very good. Now we are pushing up very hard on 7 o'clock, so I think we'll call an end to the questions there. I just want to remind people of our upcoming events. If you're interested in Asia, tomorrow we have an event that's organized by the Victoria branch on Asia after the pandemic. Coming up, we have, a new one, 25th of May, Contest for the Indo-Pacific. That must be Rory Medcalf, it is indeed. And that, I think, is put on by the Queensland branch. We also have Professor Yoichiro Sato, who was here with us today on the 27th of May. Sorry, I said March before, I meant May. And he's going to be speaking on Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy. And we have a host of others, not yet announced, is Amy Katalinak, who's going to be talking about Japanese electoral policy and how that works with COVID-19. We have Clive Hamilton and Marika Olberg talking about their new book, Hidden Hand, which is a successor to Hamilton's Silent Invasion. And there's plenty more. Just check out the website, internationalaffairs.org.au/events, and you can see them all. And we'll also be sending out a direct email for those of you who will get it. So all that's left for me to do is to thank you for tuning in, thank our members for being members, and if you're not a member, please do consider being a member. And for me to thank Alexander, who's been a fantastic guest and has provided us with lots of information on this topic. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Bryce, and thank you. Big thanks to the audience. Great questions, and thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Okay, and so from me, it's good night.
Good night, Bryce.